Hello everyone, Wes from Marquis Paranormal here with part 2 of our look at the history of ITC. Last week we looked at the early 1900s to 1949 and ended with Marcello Bocci. This week we'll continue by looking at the 1950s to the early 1970s. Back in the early 1950s in Italy, two Catholic priests, Father Ernetti and Father Gemli, were collabing on some music research. Ernetti was a well-respected, internationally known scientist, philosopher, and music lover, while Gemli was president of the papal community. It was on September 15, 1952, exactly 57 years from the upload of this video, that the priests were recording a Georgian chant. A wire on their magnetophone kept breaking, and an exasperated Father Gemelli looked at the heavens and begged his father for help. Now you can imagine the surprise on the two men's faces when, upon replay, they heard Gemelli's father's voice answer, "Of course I shall help you. I am always with you." Naturally, they had to repeat the experiment, and when they did, heard a clear voice jokingly say, "But Zucchini, it is, dear. Don't you know it is I?" Father Gemelli was shocked. Nobody knew that his father's nickname for him was Zucchini. He knew it had to be his father. But excitement later turned to fear. The Catholic Church had strong opinions against communication with the dead. He spoke to the Pope about his misgivings. To his relief, the Pope patted him on the shoulder and said, "Dear Father Gemli, you really need not worry about this. The existence of this voice is strictly a scientific fact and has nothing whatsoever to do with spiritism. The recorder is totally objective. It receives and records only sound waves from wherever they come. This experiment may perhaps become the cornerstone for building for scientific studies which will strengthen people's faith in a hereafter." Now, although Gemli felt better about the experience after that conversation, he made sure that the tapes weren't released until 1990, nearly 40 years later. We now need to go ahead 7 years later and look at someone who was considered a pioneer in recorded voice phenomena. It was in 1959, while recording bird songs, that Swedish film producer Fredrik Jurgensen heard upon playback a male voice say, "Bird voices in the night." He listened more intently to his tapes and heard his mother's voice say, "Fredrik, you're being watched. Friedel, my little Friedel, can you hear me?" Jurgensen said that when he heard his mother's voice, he was convinced that he made an important discovery. He spent the next 4 years recording hundreds of disembodied voices. He played the tapes during an international press conference and in 1964 published his book, Voices from the Universe, followed by another, Radio Contact with the Dead. In 1967, Radio Contact with the Dead was translated into German, and Latvian psychologist Dr. Konstantin Rodive skeptically took a look at it. He paid Jurgensen a visit to learn about how he had made the tapes and decided to experiment on his own. Just as Jurgensen had, Rodive received his mother's voice calling him by his childhood name. "Kostulet, this is your mother." Rodive would later publish his book, The Inaudible Becomes Audible, based upon 72,000 voices he had recorded. In 1971, after hearing of Rodive's experiments, the chief engineers of Pi Records decided to do a controlled experiment with him. They invited him to their sound lab and installed special equipment to block out any possible radio and TV frequencies. Rodive wasn't allowed to touch the equipment. He used one tape recorder, which was monitored by a control tape recorder. He was only allowed to speak into the microphone. The sound engineers recorded Rodive's voice for 18 minutes. None of them heard any other voices during the recording process, but upon playback they were astonished to hear over 200 voices had been recorded. The sound engineers recorded Rodive's voice for 18 minutes. None of them heard any other voices during the recording process, but upon playback they were astonished to hear over 200 voices had been recorded. Well, that does it for part 2 on the history of ITC. Next week we'll take a look into the 1970s a little bit further. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Until next time, this has been Wes from Marquis Paranormal, reminding you to stay true, keep believing, and I'll see you in the comments.